perhaps this a starting point for this conversation in where are the minefields when it comes to elections, deepfakes, misinformation, and how can we sort of avoid those, or at least manage them? I don't think we can avoid them, but how can we manage them?
Yeah. So I alluded to this. I wrote a paper actually back in 2020 with a computer ethicist. It was published in 2020. We were working on it in 2019. So this is just a couple years after deepfakes were kind of started gaining some consciousness in the public. And what we did in that paper was we explored a range of different possibilities for how deepfakes, including both video and audio, could be used to upset elections and electoral processes. Now, back in 2019, when we were doing the research, this was very speculative. So these scenarios that we built were based on the trends and the capabilities of the technology, and we tried to explore a range of different ways that the technology might be used or misused. And what we came up from analyzing the scenarios that we wrote included things like harms to viewers of deepfakes, like deception, intimidation, as well as harms to the subjects of deepfakes, like misattribution for statements. We have this idea of persona plagiarism, which kind of flips around the idea of plagiarism and is a misattribution of a statement to someone's persona. We explored harms like reputational harms, of course, more broadly, which I think are crucial in an election context. And then we also look at harms to society, like the erosion of trust. And I think there's lots of different ways that these harms can manifest, right? Deception could include a generated message that misinforms a voter about a voting location. Intimidation could be something like you get a pornographic image of yourself in your chat program that's used to shame or maybe blackmail you to vote in one way or another. You could have statements that are misattributed to political actors like candidates or former associates of candidates to damage reputations, or even maybe to bolster the reputation of a candidate. Like if you could imagine a positive testimonial from a prior constituent being faked. So sort of more of an astroturfing kind of thing with deepfakes. So in terms of your question, Tshepo, what can we do about this? I definitely think campaigns need to be defending candidates against reputational harm, potentially with verifiable recordings of events and appearances, really recording as much as possible so that you have evidence that is verified, that you can say, this is where the candidate was at XYZ time. They were not in that situation that's depicted. Also, thinking about forensics tools that might be able to provide some evidence of whether or not a piece of media is authentic or not. I think journalists could also consider building custom models that might detect, let's say, a candidate's voice, where a human ear might not be able to tell the difference, but a computer model might be able to pick up on subtle voice differences. I think there's a lot to think about there. One of the things that I think worries me most is this idea that's been termed the liar's dividend, which is the idea that deepfakes make it easier to lie because you can always suggest that something is a deepfake. So it becomes easier to deny something that actually did happen, because as the public, as individuals learn to be more critical and skeptical of media, because we know it could be a deepfake, then they begin to doubt the real video and audio evidence as well, which becomes quite a challenge for credibility in our media ecosystem, which is, mediated. So because we're not there, we rely on other people to mediate those experiences. And it really, I think, erodes trust in general. So I'm going to stop there, but thanks.
Thanks, Nick. Laura, Andrew, I see you guys were nodding quite a bit there while Nick was talking. How are you guys going about as fact checkers in managing this minefield of deepfakes?
I can go. Okay, related to what Nick just told us, we have a great example in Argentina with a picture that it was a real one. It was a birthday party in the official residence of the president during the lockdown, where we're supposed not to be with other people, not more than 5. And they were celebrating. And when that image was published, the government at the beginning said, that's a fake. And that make us, as fact checkers, produce a really in detail analysis of the piece, explaining the public different details with older pictures from the same space in that public residence, showing the people that it wasn't a fake. And obviously, fact checkers' work before generated AI was tough, and now it's much more difficult. But I'm not trying to be the positive in the room, but in general I am. What I'm saying is that all this new technology also give us, the audiences, more awareness about the possibilities of creating fakes or false videos or audios. And one of the really good things for me is that obviously we, and I repeat this, we are obsessed not with the well-informed citizens that perhaps have the chance to use some tools to identify a deepfake or realize that, for example, Messi, that is the Argentinian soccer player, never speak in English. And then when their peer endorsement of Messi in English to a candidate, they can realize he's not real audio. These examples that are massive help us to create more critics or more awareness in the public, that I think they are useful for elections. And obviously all the trust problems are problems that we should deal with, and not just fact checkers, media, all the public organizations should deal with how we reestablish some trust. And in general, my answer is being better and being more transparent, and also being transparent in all the uses that we do to AI. And then, for example, in our articles, we start using AI as full fact 5 or 6 years ago in 2017. And we always disclose, this is a statement identified by our Chequeado bot, an AI tool that helps us to, for example, identify checkable or factable statements. And then being transparent about the uses, we are also teaching or helping the audiences or the citizens to know that we are using that in different and many ways.
Andrew, do you want to come in there with how you guys are going about managing this minefield?
Sure. I mean, managing the minefield is a big old statement, isn't it? I think one thing that I have a kind of duality in my views on is we need to be careful not to overstate the problem in terms of the actual volume of synthetically generated content that we're dealing with is quite small. I mean, the vast majority of the information that we're fact checking is real text that statements that people have made, real information, and the very small minority of it currently is artificially generated. But we can see that this is most likely on an upward trajectory. And so we need to start to think about how can we deal with that. And against the backdrop of elections, well, EU elections, Indian elections, and of course the US election, which is going to have so much money thrown against it. And we know that that's going to generate some really plausible things for people to engage with. I mean, I would assume perhaps in the election in the US, it will be quite likely that some sort of voice chatbot type thing will exist. So it feels like you're having a conversation with a politician. I'm sure it will be kind of attributed so that you know it is a synthetic version, but you can see that kind of thing happening because they're so plausible concepts for people to latch onto. And we see this quite a lot with public understanding of concepts like deep fakes are quite high because it's easy to engage with. It is an artificially generated video that could be made about me. Is something that people can work with. And I think the challenge is potentially in the really reduced barrier to entry to some of these tools. We've gone through a cycle maybe in the last 4 or 5 years of the kind of thing that was possible in an academic or a research environment to create this synthetic type content, to probably all of us on this panel and the 132 people watching along have probably got an app on their phone that is going to create something using AI in a few seconds. And that changes the landscape, because what happens if there's just a flood of plausible but unreal information? And we're not really set up very well to defend against that across lots of different interfaces in terms of platforms' defenses of that. And particularly the media literacy as well, of making sure that we have the terminology, the skills to understand and explain these kind of things. Because at the moment, we're in a position of trying to explain hallucinations in chat interfaces. And it's quite a weird concept to explain to somebody, and particularly where foundations that we've had for a long time of look for a citation for this, look for a reference for this, may exist, but they're made up. And that we just haven't really worked out how do we describe that kind of environment where the things we would say are your lines of defense don't work anymore. And so I think that's something to consider. And also, potentially, elections have a cycle that is relatively, at times, you can predict. We know that in a lot of elections, there will be 3 or 4 big numbers that get bandied around from political parties. There'll be some hot topic issues which we can maybe predict in each nation in advance. And there will be some electoral misinformation, some of the things that perhaps Nick was referring to, of you can vote for this party on this day and this party on the following day, or you can only vote with this color pen. I mean, Lau, I'm sure you've probably seen that every election that you've covered in Chequeado. Like these things happen time and time again. So there is predictability in elections, and we know that will work. There is a media literacy component where the landscape and the information environment changes that we really need to engage with. And there is a plausible potential for large volumes of synthetic content to be generated around the next election cycles. And we don't really, across the whole stack of the ways that people interface with content, have clear answers for how we want to engage with those. But as fact checkers have to be, I am hopeful that we can find ways to deal with these things, because this is a prescient problem. We're talking about it here, but a lot of people are talking about it. This is a generational moment where the way we are communicating is changing, and that at least makes sure that we have eyeballs and over time, hopefully, resource to start addressing some of these things.
Yeah, sorry, just adding on Andrew, we did a kind of typology of 10 types of electoral disinformation. We did that in a research. We analyzed all the electoral processes in Latin America during 2 years. And we identified 10 types that are in all the countries in the region. And then we tested when we start Factchequeado in the US. And we tested in the 2018, in the 2020, and in the 2022 election, and we confirmed that they were also there. Probably there are 10 types of electoral disinformation that if we do the research, we can find also in Africa, Asia, and Europe, as Andrew said. But what is good from that is we have some patterns. We can not prevent, but we can do pre-banking, we can do articles. The authorities can have in advance prepare that data in ways that are not necessarily long text and no one gonna read to address that disinformation. And the other thing is we are also trying in our articles, and I know Full Fact is also doing, and other colleagues around the world, to be really clear with the audience related to what we can prove it is AI content and what we can't. And that part of our challenging, journalists don't like uncertainty, and we should be, in some cases, careful not to say everything is AI. I'm not sure if it is AI or it is other technology that I don't know yet. then trying to continue our media literacy work also with all this momentum of AI, I think is important.
I want to come back to a point that Nick, you made about predictive journalism, and I think Andrew also touched a bit on it. But before I get to that, Laura, Argentina just had elections a couple of weeks ago, interesting ones for that fact. How did you guys navigate this period, and what can other newsrooms do to prepare for their upcoming elections?
Yeah, the Argentinian election didn't have much AI content. As Andrew said, probably this is related with the money in the campaign that is not necessarily the same that we probably gonna see in the US. And then during Factchequeado, we saw more videos already created for campaigns for pre-candidates in the US than what we saw in Argentina. And I'm not saying we are not going to see AI in Spanish. What I'm saying is that they are not using it yet, or they are not necessarily experimenting in different languages than English in the same way that they are in English. And probably because, and that happened with all the tools in languages different than English, because the technology is bad in languages different than English. It's more obvious that someone is talking and the audio is different in that language. But related to Argentina, we prepare for much more than what we saw in terms of AI content created. And what we saw is, as Andrew mentioned, the traditional content that we call deepfakes, that in some cases are just images with a text changed, or just lies from politicians saying things that are not accurate, and all of that type of common or used content.
And I don't know how common it is, and certainly I think I agree that the language tools, the AI generation tools, are not maybe not as adept with Spanish. But I did see some reporting from the New York Times a couple of weeks ago pointing out some of the more visual uses of generative AI, like generating campaign posters, campaign rhetoric, images, those kinds of things. And so maybe that's also a use of the technology that is not so bound to the limitations of language, and it's just more of the visual portrayal of different candidates. And there were some examples in that reporting of its use in the Argentinian context.
Yeah, in Argentina, we had one of the most viral disinformation with an image from one of the most relevant candidates consuming cocaine, that it was a fake, but we are not sure that was AI generated. Perhaps this was just a Photoshop well done. And that's why I'm not sure, and I can't say it was AI. They used a picture.
Yeah, I mean, the crazy thing is also, like, Photoshop has the same technology in it now. So even as we talk about this, if we say, well, we don't know if it was Photoshop, I mean, that is AI. I mean, or it could be Photoshop with their AI plugin that's doing the manipulation. So I think it's, to your point, I think it's very difficult to know. Yeah,
for sure, we had images manipulated, and you are right in terms of we expect much more than that audio or other type of technology that perhaps, I'm not saying it's not going to arrive or not going to improve, but now it's not as good.
I see a comment from Sohan, and they say the counter disinfo moderation in non-English languages is also very bad. And so my assumption is for non-English speaking countries or newsrooms, we are safe. That's what I'm getting, for now, at least. Also, I remember, guys, you can really ask your questions using the Q&A function. I don't want to hog the mic, and I want to really jump into a question we have from Gaston already. And this is for you, Laura. They said, how do you handle fact-checking that's highly politicized, with highly politicized statements without alienating certain segments of society? For instance, Chequeado labeled Milei's climate change claims as false, sparking negative reactions from his supporters. Similarly, fact-checking statements made by figures like Donald Trump and the UK Conservative Party on climate change or other divisive issues can lead to negative reactions from their followers. So how does Chequeado maintain its commitment to fact-checking without alienating significant portions of the electorate?
That is a question that I can answer if I'm serious.
Yes.
Is how we deal before Milei is one thing. How we deal after Milei probably is a different one, because in Argentina we didn't have in the past just one party with the main lies on their back. We found lies all around, not necessarily in the same amount, but more or less. What happened now is that probably this can change. We are not sure, but that's perhaps what happened. And then part of our strategy and our plans with the team is, okay, perhaps we should partner with supporters for Milei to use our content in different ways that we are not necessarily going to present, but that can allow us to have more reputation with them. We are obviously continue saying what is false, and we are not going to create this false equilibrium between candidates or parties if it's not the situation. And we are not going to do what probably some people want, is to be just the opposition of a candidate that more than 50% of the society decide to make president. Then we're going to continue doing journalists and probably changing the way to partner with different actors that help us to do that liaison with people that probably are not going to read us or to listen to us in the same way that in the past.
Andrew, I know you guys at Full Fact sort of almost worked on a similar idea with Keir Starmer, with his fake audio being created by AI. I'm keen to know how you guys were able to verify that process.
Yeah, sure. So I think building on some of the stuff that Laura has been sharing, I mean, I would say that Laura is representing Chequeado and Factchequeado, who are like two of the very best fact checkers in the world. So what she says is basically +1 from me at all points. Like, this is all really good stuff. And I think the point there around how do you ensure that people don't become alienated by fact checking is quite an interesting route into this. So I think it's important that so often I'll get asked some variant of a question of who fact checks the fact checkers or something like that, but the idea being that it's everybody. So a fact check is to say, here is some evidence, here is everything that we have, and here is a conclusion that we've reached, and here's how we've reached that conclusion. And that's really important in trying to articulate people's trust in these things. You should be able to go away and run these numbers yourself, check the underlying information, and see if you agree with the conclusion. And that's all that it can ever be. And that becomes really important in this world of verifications, as Laura was saying, about the fact that there is ambiguity sometimes. And in the UK, we had an example of this with some audio that purported to be of Keir Starmer. This was in a fact check that Full Fact wrote a few weeks ago. And the conclusion effectively was that it was not possible for us to definitively say whether this audio was synthetically generated or not. From a technical point of view, we could go and speak to experts, and they would say that, you know, you could give maybe a percentage of confidence or something like that, but that is not the same as being able to say absolutely this is synthetically generated or not. And that's quite challenging, because I would say that the tooling around detection of artificially generated content is, I don't know, $1 trillion business. The people who can crack this will do very, very well. And right now, it's not really plausible to do that. And certainly with audio that can be generated from, I think it's what, 20, 30 seconds of someone speaking voice is enough to be able to create some plausible content from them. That creates challenges, and particularly with audio, actually, where there are less cues to work from. So if it's visual content, you can start to look for certain things in the background. You can look at motion, you can look at eyes, you can look at some traditional things like the number of fingers that somebody has, that kind of stuff, facial expressions. There are things that can really lead you. Audio lacks some of those cues. And so with the Keir Starmer example, we could see maybe that the background noise was more consistent than potentially you might normally see. And normally there'd be some sort of modulation of noise in the background, but not enough to work from. And so we had to write a fact check that is about showing the information that we have. So it would be broadly unlikely for the leader of the opposition to be saying these kind of things. And it would be unlikely given that the source of the information was an account that had been known to share misinformation previously. So it was drawn to our attention from an account that had a track record of sharing a certain type of information. And also that the Labour Party, of which Keir Starmer is a politician, said that it wasn't him speaking. That isn't enough. Obviously, that is one piece of information, but contextually in the round, we came to the conclusion that it was unlikely. But it had some ambiguity in it because simply the perfect detection of these kind of audio things is not there. And so our conclusion was that there was no evidence that this purported clip was of Keir Starmer, but that is not the same as saying that it is definitely not. And I think that pipeline of tooling is going to become really important. And I think there's an element of making sure that these people who are working on the front line, and I think fact checking, is the front line of misinformation at sometimes, need to ensure that we have access to the very, very best, most sophisticated technology. And in part, that comes down to relationships with internet companies to make sure that fact checkers have the right tools to help with the right verification processes as well.
What I like about your response, Andrew, is that I think it really points out maybe the future that we're all heading into, where the truth is an uncertain thing. And I feel like there's maybe a little bit of a tendency in journalism to overstate certainty in certain ways, to try to make things clear by reducing the amount of uncertainty that's communicated. But I think certainly when you get into fact checking generally, or fact checking, these kinds of pieces of media that might be AI generated but might not, there's always going to be uncertainty. And the way that you communicate that uncertainty to audiences, the way you reflect that, the way you couch that and convey that, I think those are all going to be important skills for fact checkers, for journalists to be able to communicate effectively. And I totally agree that there's got to be tooling around that as well, because the tools need to reflect uncertainty. You can't have a tool that's overconfidently saying, yeah, this clip is AI generated, but underneath the tool actually had a whole range of uncertainties that it was dealing with. So I think as we think about tooling for these things, we should also think about, how do we make sure those tools reflect the kinds of uncertainties that journalists and fact checkers want to know about and need to potentially convey to their audiences.
I love what you said, Nick, but in general, people, and also in some cases, funders, are looking for just magical solutions, imagining that they can have a tool just to tell them in a second if something is false or not. And I think all the people that work in the field of fact checking before or after AI generated know that in general, the details are the most important, the context, the tone, the sound, the humor, etc. And then we suspect that is not necessarily going to be in a toolbox or in a toolkit. But obviously, all the tools and having the chances, not just in the newsrooms that are from the north or the big ones, fact checkers organization, but all the small fact-checking or newsrooms in the world can have the chance to access to these tools, it's a key part of the challenge that we have. In the past, in Chequeado, we work when in 2019 election, an audio from one candidate was really viral. We partnered with a group of sound engineers from the public science program or institution in the country, and they gave us, not free, but with an honorarium that were at that time feasible for us, and we use it. And the technology is the same that the judiciary system use when they have telephone treats for people, and they ask these sound engineers to identify if that was or not the person that was accused. Then it's not that the technology is not there. In some cases, what is not is not working or partnership with journalists or fact checkers.
Cool, thanks. Thanks, guys. Closely related to this, and I'm not sure if you guys can answer this. Barbara is asking, do you think technical tools planned by the Content Authenticity Initiative, and I'm assuming these content tools that Barbara is referring to are the JavaScript SDK, C2PA tool, and the Rust SDK, can be of any use, or will those obstacles always be overcome?
Sure, I can have a little go answering some of that. So I think it's an important part of this. So the broadly Content Authenticity Initiative, it is so hard to say, is a good idea in the idea of being able to try and articulate provenance. And provenance becomes quite an important part of this. So conceptually, if the BBC in the UK were to produce some video content, and that video content comes from a camera that is then processed and goes through some sort of technique to then become a news broadcast on the television that then goes onto YouTube, that then goes into someone's browser, how can you understand whether that piece of content has been adapted? So is it the stuff that was originally broadcast? Has it been edited? Has the context been changed to suggest something that wasn't there? And the broad idea of the initiative would be that you would have some sort of verification. Let's say it's a green tick that you could somehow access and say, okay, this video is definitely the original video. That is, I think, a really important and compelling part of a wider suite of information that is needed. So the idea of being able to say, this is authentic. I think the challenge becomes broadly speaking, let's say that some people you want to trust can produce that content. Also, the bad actors have access to exactly the same content. So they can create something and say, this is absolutely authentic. And then you've got to get to the position where the end user has got to say, okay, both of these videos are authentic. I now need to decide whether I trust the original source that's behind them. And then that comes back to another thing about who do you decide to trust? And I think part of the challenge that we're facing here is the web, the internet as it envisaged, was a very distributed system. So anybody could say anything about anything at any time. And that is a wonderful and beautiful thing. If we become increasingly reliant on a small section of good information, trusted information, I think it's very problematic because that just doesn't scale. It's not the way that people consume information. So CAI is a really important and interesting tool, but it can't be, and I don't think it's suggested as, the only solution to part of this. It's a factor into a much wider ecosystem of tooling.
And what I like about it is that it does, to Andrew's point, it does make the credibility calculus about the source of the information. And so, if your trusted brand of media is using content authenticity to basically provide evidence that what they're showing you was the original version, provided that you trust that source, then you can trust what you're looking at. And I think that also opens up another topic that we could talk about literacy, media literacy, and people's literacy for understanding things, but also people's understanding of what the content authenticity process is? Do I need to also trust that process in order to know that I should then base my trust on the source because the process is trustworthy? So I think there's a lot of communication and education that might need to be done around the initiative so that people understand it. But I think if we do that, and if the initiative is successful and proliferates, and that the media, the trusted media, adopts it, I think it could be a nice measure to take against inauthentic content. And I guess we'll see where it goes.
We've got a couple of minutes left before the end of the session, and I really want us to perhaps leave the session on a positive note. You know, I'm a bit hopeful, and I want to get from all three of you, where are the sort of benefits, opportunities that AI has for newsrooms during elections next year? What can we look at to? What tools can we adopt? Anything? Give me something positive that newsrooms can take away from this.
I mean, I would just throw out the word satire. I mean, I think there's so much potential here for political satire with generative AI. That could be entertaining satire. It could be biting satire. Doing that in a way so as not to deceive viewers, but to convey political criticism, like any kind of political cartoon. That's probably the most positive vision I could have for the technology. I think there's also like more speculative uses, and I think we're going to see how campaigns try to leverage this. Like you could imagine a campaign training a deepfake on a competitor and hooking it up to a ChatGPT kind of thing to help their candidate practice for a debate. I mean, you know, I don't know. Maybe that's a positive thing. Maybe candidates think that's useful for preparation, or maybe not. But it could be a speculatively interesting thing to explore.
In our case, or Andrew, you want to go, or I jump? Okay. In our case, we also have or start working with you know that outside the central countries, WhatsApp is a big deal, and then part of what we are trying to generate is we've been doing fact checks since 2010, and some of the mistakes or the lies are in a country with some of the extract problems that are the same: poverty, inflation, and others. And then we are trying to create a chatbot with much more chances to be or to include emotions and a kind of conversation that is not just our fact check in a formal way. And that is something that in the past, it wasn't necessarily as easy for our developer teams as it is today. Then we are not sure we're going to have it perfect, but as we did always with the tools, we're going to be just experimenting with a chatbot, starting with a small group, receiving feedback and changing. And we expect to have, not for next year, but for the next election, that is going to be crucial for Argentina, because it's going to be the first Milei election in the Congress already built.
I think we're almost at time, so I'll go really, really quickly on this. I'm hopeful because fact checkers are amazing, and there are the collaboration of fact checkers around the world. There's 200 or 300 fact checkers, and they are so good. I'm incredibly hopeful about that. I'm hopeful because AI is powerful, and it's a wonderful thing that we're seeing the creative possibilities that come from that. The artistry, the kind of content that can be created is exciting, and we should remember to be allowed to be excited by these things. And I'm hopeful, and this is incredibly boring, but I'm hopeful because AI is great at something that I guess you might refer to as boring magic. Like, it's very good at creating efficiencies, And efficiency is a very boring thing to say I'm hopeful about, but when you're dealing with relatively small teams facing really large problems, AI is so good at making sure that you can go faster and smarter and make better choices. And I believe that the power of the AI in generating misinformation and disinformation is exactly the same technology that can be used to make sure that fact checkers, journalists, people who care about good information can be faster and smarter and more productive. And that is a really exciting thing to happen.
Awesome. I love that. Thank you so much to Laura, Nick, and Andrew. This was quite an insightful session. I wish we had more time because I feel like this is an important topic for me, but for a lot of newsrooms that have elections coming up. Thank you so much.